Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. I'm Ian Bailey, a staff reporter with the Globe and Mail in Ottawa. I'm pleased to be your host and your moderator today. We have a great discussion ahead, but first, as always in this kind of thing, I'd like to share some housekeeping notes for the program we're going to have in the next little bit. You can view today's webcast in both English and French. To switch languages, please use the button on the upper left part of your screen as shown here. As we go along, please feel welcome to add comments and questions for today's speakers using the live Q&A button on the upper right of your screen, as shown here. We will take a few questions towards the end. If you're having a technical issue, please click the purple button called Support Chat in the lower left of your screen, as shown here. On the same screen, we've also identified how you can turn on captions. It's the three little vertical buttons on the lower right of your video player. Now, before we begin the discussions, I'd like to acknowledge that the Globe and Mail headquarters is situated on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. My colleagues and I are grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this land. We are also grateful for the guidance of community leaders and elders as we navigate issues of national importance, such as the Black Justice Strategy, which we're going to be talking about today. We are also pleased to have such a community leader here today to open and close our event. Joining us from Halifax is Juanita Peters, Executive Director of the Africville Museum. Ms. Peters is known by many people as many things. She's an actor, film and stage director. She's also a playwright. She has received the Queen Elizabeth II Platinum Jubilee Medal and the King Charles III Coronation Medal in recognition of her achievements in leadership. Welcome, Ms. Peters.
Thank you, everybody. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be with you this afternoon. I'm coming to you from Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, covered by the historic 18th century treaties of peace and friendship. And I must tell you that by blood, I am Mi'kmaq, I'm Maliseet, and I'm also Black, which is not an unusual combination for African Nova Scotians who have lived and worked in friendship with our Indigenous brothers and sisters for hundreds of years. As an African Nova Scotian, we've been here for over 400 years. I am eighth generation and can trace my roots right back to the American Revolution because my seventh grandfather was Thomas Peters, who came as a sergeant with the Black Loyalists. Now, I tell you this because we're all viewed by not who or what we are, but by what society perceives us to be. And we're actually all guilty of this, whether we recognize it, whether we like it or not. The difference about being Black in this country is that it often demotes and diminishes our very existence, our capabilities, and our expectations by others. So that being said, sometimes I feel very debilitated to know that I'm still having a lot of the same conversations that my forefathers had so many years ago. And when we talk about racism, most people think of the overt examples, like that experience recently with Michael B. Jordan and Delroy Lindo. While presenting an award, they heard the N-word in the audience. The individual who delivered that has Tourette syndrome, and the Black awards presenters are asked to, for a lack of better words, make peace with that. And the show executives spent more time trying to contextualize the outburst, explain it, rather than immediately apologizing to the two Black presenters. When my son was 18 years old and finishing high school and working two part-time jobs, he would lay in bed and organize what he was going to wear each day, with a special consideration to whether or not he may have to stand at a bus stop or take public transit. No hoodie, no dark clothes, be perfectly fully visible. These are the long-term effects of silent racism, the messages to our most valued assets, the next generation of strong Black individuals. This is what they take home. Recently, my ear caught a portion of a conversation around the rise of crime across Canada. What really struck me, again, there appeared to be a strong need to contextualize this information by reassuring the public that it's the lower crimes that are on the rise because of the economy. This led me to believe that perhaps the justice system is prepared to make more lenient fines or punishments for those very crimes that Black people have racked up criminal records for over a century. Only being able to access lower paying jobs, fewer real opportunities, despite their actual aptitude. It's not been the Black population's aptitude that has held us back, but the societal attitude that has locked generations in a place of little progress. In 2010, a historic event happened in Halifax, an apology for the former residents and descendants of Africville. The apology gave way to a new story that could be written. A museum would tell the story of a resilient Black community who made a way out of nothing, and yet suffered some of the worst environmental racism seen in Canada. As part of the apology, monies were given to build a museum, but there was nothing given to help it succeed. But like the little train that could, without government operational funding, that little museum is now a National Historic Site and also an international UNESCO site of history and memory linked to enslavement and the slave trade. Currently, the only site in Canada to hold this designation. The story of Africville shows up all over the world where brown and Black people exist. Our communities become dumping grounds for what the rest of the world does not want. Well, we don't want it either. And racism still shows up. As recently as 2023, three men walked into the grounds of the Africville Museum and shot up all the windows of the museum. A few months later, someone put a noose in the Africville Park. Racism still exists. Canada's work on anti-racism policies has been slow, but I'm extremely proud of the communities and committees that refuse to give up. I, for one, are looking forward to today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you kindly, Ms. Peters. We're looking forward to seeing you again at the conclusion of this webcast. Next, on behalf of the Globe and Mail, I'd like to recognize the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, or the CRRF, for making today's event possible. And to say a few words, I'd like to welcome to the screen Mohammed Hashim, CEO and Executive Director of the CRRF.
Thank you, Ian. Not sure if you can see me. Oh, there we go. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Ian, and thank you, Juanita, for your wise words and for your leadership. My name is Mohammed Hashim. I'm the Canadian. I work at the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, and I just want to first acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples, and is now home to many other diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. This is the fifth and final event of our Finding Common Ground series. I just want to take a minute to say thank you to the Global Mail for making these conversations possible. And of course, a big thank you to our wonderful CRF team and board of directors who have also made this possible. One of the CRF's major functions is to bring people together, to talk about tough issues around race and drive change. And this series has created space for innovative ideas to move public policy further. Canada's Black Justice Strategy is a roadmap for all justice-related systems to improve, guided by the experience of Black victims, offenders, lawyers, those wrongfully convicted, advocates, and those targeted or harmed by the many systems that are meant to be fair and equal to everyone. We have all seen report after report that stood on shelves. This strategy took all of them, aggregated the recommendations, tested them for current relevance, did further consultation, and created a map, a path for all the criminal justice systems to improve. The recommendations made not only help Black communities, but improve the entire system to work better for all of us. It's a 10-year strategy, and the work has begun. In 2024, the federal government provided funding for 2 years, and yet there's still so much more that needs to be done. Have asked for these changes for decades, and we must remain steadfast to build a system for all of us. I want to extend my sincere thank you to the Foundation for Black Communities and their Director of Strategic Initiatives, Fatma Hassan. Fatma was our inaugural Director of Public Policy at the CRF, and in her career, she's played many instrumental roles. And with us, she was one of the main architects for the Combating Hate Hub and is now widely recognized as a national expert in hate crimes in Canada. I also want to thank the Black Opportunity Fund and their CEO, Craig Wellington. Craig has been a passionate and tireless advocate for improving outcomes for Black Canadians, including Black entrepreneurs and Black-owned and Black-led businesses. It's a pleasure to work with both Fatma and Craig and their organizations in bringing this event to life. Welcome, everyone, and I look forward to robust conversations and insights today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mohammed. And now our panel discussion. We have a terrific group of leaders and experts here to talk about Canada's Black Justice Strategy. Let's introduce our speakers. First, we have Dr. Akwazi Owusu-Bempah, who's an associate professor with the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto. His work focuses on the intersections of race, crime, and the criminal justice. Akwazi is also the co-author and co-chair of Canada's Black Justice Strategy. Welcome, Akwazi.
Here we are.
Next, we have Ruth Goba, Executive Director of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, also known as LEAF. Before joining LEAF, Ruth worked as a consultant. She was regularly called upon by government, schools, legal firms, and others to conduct investigations, provide training, and to speak about human rights, equity, and anti-Black racism. Welcome to Ruth.
Thank you.
And also joining us is Martine St. Louis, Director of Canada's Black Justice Strategy. Martine is in the policy sector, with the Federal Department of Justice. She is a public service leader who translates policy into action, and she'll be doing just that as the Black Justice Strategy moves through implementation. Welcome to everyone. Let's get into our discussion. Martine, I'd like to start with you. For those in the audience who aren't familiar with Canada's Black Justice Strategy, could you provide a brief summary of what it is? And also, could you tell us where it came from, who came up with the idea, and how this was born?
A very good question. And thank you. I'm very honored and privileged to be part of this conversation today. It is an important initiative that holds very close and dear to my heart. So very happy and proud to be here. So in terms of the strategy, the Canada's Black Justice Strategy essentially aims to address the overrepresentation of Black people at every stage of the criminal justice system, including as victims and survivors of crime, and to ensure that all people in Canada have access to equal treatment before and under the law, as guaranteed by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. You asked the question about where the strategy came from. Well, it's associated with the United Nations Decade for People of African Descent, we're in our currently second decade of it, which will end in 2034. But what happened in 2016 is a working group came to Canada to learn about what is happening in terms of impacts on people of African descent in Canada. And within one of their recommendations in the report that they shared with Canada in 2017, they literally indicated that a strategy needed to be developed to address overrepresentation of Black people in the criminal justice system. So this strategy is in response to that United Nations Justice Pillar, and we're continuing on with this initiative and moving into the way forward with the implementation.
What are the key pieces of the strategy in a nutshell?
The key pieces of the strategy. So I want to say that at the beginning, with the engagement that took place with the strategy, we made sure that this really was reflecting Black voices and Black situations across the country. We also engaged with an external steering group that was identified by the Government of Canada to work with. This really needed to be a people-centered focused initiative. So it was important that we had a steering group that had Black representatives, Black experts, from criminal justice lawyers to academics, including my fellow panel here, panel member, Dr. Kwasi. And so it was really important to make sure that this was centered on Black experiences across Canada. What we quickly realized is with this strategy, there's situations happening before people are impacted by the criminal justice system, and also what's happening in the criminal justice system, as well as once people are out of the criminal justice system. So it was really an overarching, huge effort that's required to make a difference in this regard. And so the report that was published and released, produced by the steering group members for Canada's Black Justice Strategy, really had 8 overarching recommendations and remaining addresses for policing, for courts, corrections, and parole and reintegration. And so it was important that this report emphasized the need to address racial profiling and to create Black specific programs for offenders. The report emphasizes the need to invest in prevention by looking at elements such as education, employment, housing, health, and mental health, where negative outcomes can increase the risk of a person coming into contact with the criminal justice system. So, for example, studies have connected racism, which prevents many Black youth from getting a job, and that increases risks.
Is this strategy the first of its kind in Canada, or have there been similar efforts similar to this one before? Is it?
So, Canada's Black Justice Strategy essentially is the first ever in Canada that has been mandated at the federal government of Canada level. So it builds on decades of advocacy work by Black communities who have called for an examination of the reasons underlying overrepresentation.
Have any of the provinces or territories, by the way, done any work in this area? Any helpful work in this area?
Yes, we have been working tremendously with our partners. So there's the horizontal level with federal departments, so the federal level of Government of Canada. So there's a number of departments that we are working with on a regular basis. We're also working profusely with the provinces and territories as the different responsibilities for the criminal justice system falls in different levels of the government. And so we're also working with community-based organizations, as well as ensuring that Black people's voices are recognized in this work.
How would you describe the commitment of the current government to enact this strategy?
That's a very good question. The Government of Canada made a huge commitment of this kind. I have to say, after over 20 years of working in the public service, I have never seen an initiative of this kind. So I'm very, very proud of how far we've come with this initiative. But the Government of Canada essentially made 4 commitments in the response to the report that was released by the steering group members. And the plan is a huge piece of that. So that's the implementation plan that was released a year ago, which is, I can't believe how time is flying, but it was released a year ago, and that's the 10-year implementation plan. And so this plan, we want to make sure with this initiative that it's informed by evidence, and that it really demonstrates the federal leadership while continuing to work with Black communities as well as all levels of government, as it's key, as there's responsibilities of the criminal justice system that falls in various levels of government. And we also are committed to recognizing the human and economic costs. So there's a huge cost of inaction. And so it's really important that this plan continues, that further investments occur for this implementation plan, as if we do not act, if we do not continue this initiative, it'll just result in additional costs.
I'm sorry. Sorry. Go ahead.
Just additional costs to our country, and just realizing that we are an economic focus, and so it's very important to be aware of that.
Kwasi, I'd like to bring you in next. You're the co-author and co-chair of the Black Justice Strategy. What made you decide to take on this role?
This is an area that I've been focusing on generally, issues of race and justice now for the better part of 20 years. So, I've engaged in kind of academic and policy research and strategizing on these issues. And so when the government approached me to not only take part, but to co-author and co-chair the steering group, it seemed like a next sensible step with respect to the engagement that I've been undertaking. Of course, it was a very large undertaking, and undertakings of these nature are inherently politicized in many ways. So it wasn't an easy decision, but it seemed like certainly the right thing to do from the standpoint of someone who's dedicated to almost all of their working life to focusing on and seeking to address issues of inequality and injustice. Of course, not only within our criminal justice system, but our society more generally.
There are 114 recommendations in the strategy. What would you say are the most urgent and most important?
So there are a number of overarching recommendations that we included in the strategy that are kind of bigger picture. So the establishment of departments or divisions within public safety and the Department of Justice and broader institutions as well. And I think those are extremely important. Martin had just made reference to as well, though, the social determinants of justice. It'd certainly be my wish and desire not to have to continue to address issues within the criminal justice system itself. Of course, those are important and we must focus on those. But, there's ample evidence, research evidence, and data available to demonstrate, how impactful those inequitable outcomes upstream, what we describe again as the social determinants of justice through child welfare, education, our employment sector, housing, health, and mental health, how the negative outcomes in those sectors or areas contribute to the overrepresentation that we see in the criminal justice system itself. And so, I think quite rightly, there's been a fair emphasis on those social determinants of justice. And I think we need to maybe not prioritize, but certainly ensure a sustained focus on those social determinants of justice as we continue to work on addressing the very real issues that exist within the criminal justice system itself.
You put in the work on this strategy. What are your observations about how it was released and the reaction to this document when it came out?
Yeah, it's really, I wasn't overly happy with the timing of the release of the document itself. It was released on a Friday going into a long weekend in the middle of summer. And so certainly a lack of attention immediately thereafter. We've continued to engage both with the Department of Justice as a steering group and with government more broadly. And I've been, quite heartened by the attention that we have received from major institutions. And so a thank you to this CRRF and the Globe and Mail and the other partners here, the Black Opportunity Fund, for example. And so we've been, kind of hosting and taking part in national level events to sustain the attention. Work is, very clearly being undertaken as a result of the strategy and the implementation plan that's flowed from it. And again, I really hope that work continues and that it's sustained.
Do you feel you've accomplished what you set out to accomplish when you went into work on this document, when you committed to this project?
That's a very tough question to answer. There's the reality of delivering a report and a strategy like we did in the time frame that we had. Academics spend years working on publications. You're a reporter. They call sociologists, slow journalists for a reason. And so I would have liked much more time. But with that said, again, I think it's important to note that we were building on the tremendous work that had been produced by individuals, by community organizations, and by other governments previously. And so we had a very strong basis to work with. And so I am most certainly happy with the final product in terms of the strategy itself. And I'm pleased by what I see in the implementation plan. And so could we have done more? Of course, we could have done more. We could have engaged with more people. We could have developed more recommendations, although those are already lengthy. Now our attention, of course, turns to that implementation and sustaining the strategy and the work itself.
Ruth, I'd like to bring you in. When we spoke earlier, you mentioned that one of the barriers to implementing the strategy was a lack of awareness. I wonder if you could tell us about your thoughts on that situation.
Yeah, I mean, some of it goes to first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to participate on this panel. I'm very grateful. It's such an important topic. Some of that speaks to the International Decade for People of African Descent, and the decade really, the first decade was 2015 to 2024. And we are now in our second decade, which will end in December of 2034. And the purpose of the decade was recognition, kind of acknowledging history, contributions, and ongoing racism, justice, to advance legal policy reforms to combat discrimination, improve access to justice, and address systemic bias in institutions. And the third issue was development, improve social and economic conditions. My experience as executive director when I was in that role of the Black Legal Action Center was that there wasn't a lot of knowledge about the decade. I would bring it up in speaking engagements and nobody kind of knew it existed. And I say this because the UN has been pretty clear that the first international decade, while it did raise some awareness, it fell short on implementation, right? And that was largely due to limited political will, I think, and investment. And so Canada is actually a sponsor of the second decade. But my concern is that the Black justice strategy could face a similar trajectory, right? Strong commitments on paper, but low public awareness and limited visibility. I think awareness really matters, right? Because policy momentum depends on public understanding, civil society engagement, and political accountability. And without that, strategies risk becoming kind of technical exercises rather than actual drivers of change. So I think the key question moving forward is how Canada will ensure that this moment translates into sustained visibility, measurable action, and public accountability, so that the second decade and the Black justice strategy doesn't repeat the implementation gap of the first. And so I think this phase has to be about embedding accountability and ensuring people actually know that the strategy exists. And with that, civil society engagement as well.
How can civil society and national organizations build the pressure sort of needed to secure real commitments for the strategy, especially if government support is still unclear?
I can speak to this a little bit from my experience over the past year. In March 2025, so I work for LEAF, as you know, Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, and in March 2025, the ministerial role for women and gender was eliminated, and the responsibilities were initially folded into the portfolio of the Minister of Canadian Culture and Identity. When that happened, over 400 feminist and national women's organizations, excuse me, mobilized immediately because it was pretty aware, we were very aware that structure signals commitment, right? And the move by the government triggered widespread condemnation for treating gender equity as a minor issue. The outcome, though, told us that government will listen, and this government did listen, and a minister was appointed and funding has been attributed. So I think for me, the key lesson for the Black justice strategy is that announcements aren't enough, and this is connected again to the answer I just gave you previously. Real support looks like clear government ownership, it's sustained political attention, and it's dedicated resources. It's also underscored like the role of civil society pressure in keeping equity agendas on track, right? Implementation depends on continued public sector engagement. So when we talk about support for the strategy, the question is not just whether it exists, but whether it's actually institutionally anchored, funded, and publicly accountable. And you know, I think the criminal bar needs to be made aware, judges need to be made aware, police need to be made aware. And I haven't seen, we're early days, but I haven't, with respect to the strategy, but I haven't seen evidence of this happening yet. And anecdotally, I have inquired with criminal defense attorneys, and they're not aware of it. So that is a concern for me, because they in particular will be able to have some impact on how it's implemented and how the courts see it, how prosecutors see it, how judges see it and understand it.
If governments, if as you say, the governments can listen and change from what they hear, what do they need to hear on this strategy to make this the year that there's movement on it, do you think?
I think they need to understand that governments really need to understand that Martine raised this, and that the cost of failing to implement the strategy is really significant, right? For individuals and exclusion from society, and in economic terms as well. I think it's really, really. I come from, unlike Akwasi and Martine, I'm a little bit on the outside of the strategy, and that I have been with the Black Legal Action Center and the Human Rights Commission, where we're dealing with the kind of the effects of criminalization in the criminal justice system, and what that does, what it costs. And I think it's just the as I say, the cost of failing to implement it is, I think, much greater than any costs associated with ensuring that Black communities across the country are included in Canadian society and feel a part of Canadian society and have dignity.
I put this question to Akwasi earlier, and he spoke to it. There are 114 recommendations. What do you think are the most important, the ones that should be at the top of the list for being implemented?
For me, I fall to the social determinants, right? I think because of the work that I do, it's very clear that structural barriers in education, in housing, in employment, in health shape life chances long before any interaction with police or the courts, right? And so criminalization is really, I see a downstream effect of broader policy choices. And disproportionate contact with policing, higher rates of charging, and harsher outcomes are really linked to conditions produced outside the justice system, right? Not within the justice system itself. So the school to prison, the school to prison pipeline, hyper surveillance, expulsions from school, disproportionate discipline, all lead to, in many cases, criminalization. Martine spoke about the report of the working group, the working group of experts on people of African descent, and the report that they issued in, I think it was 2016. And they made it very clear that criminalization of Black communities cannot be understood in isolation from broader structural inequities, right? And so I think the strategy must function as a whole of government equity framework, not just criminal reform. It should really prioritize the social determinants. We need investments in housing, in education, employment, competent health supports, right? Racial equity kind of analysis, I think, needs to, in all justice reforms, right? How we need to make sure that it's a part of all justice reforms, right? Assess how laws, policing practices, and sentencing policies interact with existing structural inequalities. I think for the justice strategy, for the Black justice strategy to be transformative, it has to treat social policy reform and justice reform as inseparable. And we really have to look at the root conditions that shape the pathways into the system itself, shape the pathways into the system as much as the system itself, right?
I'd
Of
love to
course.
get in there.
Of course, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, from the outset, and Ruth, thank you for that analysis. I think it's key. That emphasis on the social determinants is just so important, and that was really an inherent tension we had, when we started off with the work, is that we recognized that these upstream factors were so important. Yet the Black Justice Strategy, was an initiative situated within the Department of Justice, and so we've got the issue, of course, of federal, provincial, and municipal jurisdiction in trying to address the issues. But given the importance of those upstream factors, we talked about, Ruth's mentioned, the school to pipeline. Yes, there are individual and institutional forms of discrimination within the justice system itself that contribute to the overrepresentation that we see, and we can work to address those. But there will still be a pipeline of Black, as there are Indigenous people, making their way to that justice system because of those earlier system failures. And so, and as I mentioned, when you'd asked about the recommendations, our overarching recommendations, and our first recommendation was, and this goes to something Ruth has just mentioned, was the establishment of a department or an agency at the federal level that would be tasked with championing and coordinating efforts to advance the interests of Black people across all of government, so that we don't suffer from the silos that are so evident and embedded within government, period.
Martine, I'd like to come back to you and picking up on Akwasi's idea. I'd like your thoughts on that idea. And I'd also like you to, if I could ask you about what is the implementation plan for this strategy?
Yes, it's like we've been discussing. There's a great deal of work required to make this transformative change take place. So with this 10-year implementation plan, we've received funding for the first phase of this work. And so there's a lot that's required to advance this 10-year implementation plan. So we are currently halfway through our first phase. So it was released last year. And so we're reaching to the end of our first year of the implementation plan. The first year included having to release the implementation plan. And I know the awareness of the implementation plan isn't necessarily there, but that's part of our objective, to raise awareness. And hopefully with this dialogue today, we are making sure and raising that awareness. So with this first year of the implementation plan, yes, part of it was to release the 10-year implementation plan, but it was also to advance the initial investments that were decided in the fall economic statement in 2024. So to initiate the first 2 years of this implementation plan, the government did commit to $87.4 million being released for over 2 years. And that funding is to go across 8 departments and agencies at the federal level to essentially establish the strategy. It's not everything, but it's definitely a beginning. And in phase 2 of the strategy, which will begin after the initial investments, which will end in March 2027, the Government of Canada has committed to responding to the recommendations identified in the report as short term. So work is currently underway to advance the renewal of the strategy, but no decisions have been made as of yet.
How optimistic? Sorry, go ahead, Ruth.
If I could add one thing, just to follow up on what Martine said, and also what I said a little earlier. When I speak about social determinants, I want to be really clear. When we speak about housing and education and employment, I want to be really clear that we're not pathologizing Black communities and Black people, right? And that we recognize that these are structural inequalities, and that they should not be framed or as individual or cultural deficiencies, right? Because that then justifies heightened surveillance, intervention, and really control across systems. And that we always tend to focus on when we have these discussions, and generally, certainly in my work, the focus tends to be on what's happening with the Black community in Black communities, rather than the structure that puts them in the places where they are.
Thank you, Ruth. Martina, let's go back to you for a second. I mean, this strategy may be news to many Canadians. How confident are you that by the end of this year, folks will know? I mean, this broadcast day is raising the issue and talking about the program. How confident are you that by the end of the year, folks are going to know about this program? Because many Canadians may not know about it now.
Well, I can say that we are committed to this 10-year implementation plan. We are committed to the accountability piece. The dollar that has been invested in this initial start of implementation for the strategy, we want to make sure that this information is tracked. We want to make sure that we're working with all our partners and we're sharing updates on how things are progressing. And we want to be in a position to communicate this at some point. So we really are holding a high regard to the accountability piece because these are public funds. Can I say when it will be shared, when it will be released? I don't have that information today, but the plan is to communicate. We want to be able to go back to community-based organizations. We want to be able to go back to communities so that everybody's aware of how this is progressing. So there is a commitment on the accountability of the implementation.
How will the implementation be funded?
Right now, it's funded for the first 2 years. As I mentioned, the first 2 years, meaning we are funded for $87.4 million for the 10-year implementation plan. This will end in March 2027. And so we're currently working on the renewal process, and no decisions have been made to date, but we are working on it.
Kwasi, I'd like to turn back to you. What are your views on the risks and opportunities related to properly funding the implementation of this strategy?
The risk would be, I'm afraid, not more of the same, but situations with respect to the overrepresentation of Black people within our criminal justice system getting worse. And that has the potential to erode or a lack of engagement and advancing the recommendations, social instability and a jeopardizing of public safety. Again, I don't want to focus solely on the social determinants because the policing, courts, corrections, and reintegration and parole and reintegration pillars are important as well. But if we don't address these structural issues, the systemic and institutional racism embedded within our society and its institutions, then we run the risk of the disparities that we see in child welfare and education and employment and other housing, health and mental health getting worse, right? When we look at levels of unemployment for Black people and Black youth in particular, they are extremely high, and we've got very strong evidence of racial bias in hiring practices. What happens when people can't engage in the labor force? Well, a host of social problems, including an increased likelihood of contact with the police, either because people have idle time and are in public, or for a smaller number because they turn to crime to support themselves. And so, the investment, we have a great level of attention at the moment on our economy, on economic stability, on our fiscal situation. And I think one of the most crucial things to recognize here is that the upstream investments have large payoffs in the long term. And the the research and the estimates range anywhere from 2 to 1 to up to 13 to 1 benefit on that investment. So, from neonatal care through early childhood and onwards, investments upstream yield great benefits in the long term. And so they save money. And importantly, they improve the lives of individuals, the circumstances of communities, and ultimately benefit Canadian society. And so this is an initiative that our government should be looking at as one that can serve to strengthen Canadian society at a time in which, our Prime Minister has noted the global order is no longer what it was, and Canada needs to do all it can to ensure its economic prosperity at home and its place in the world. And so these investments, if they are forthcoming and they are sustained, can help serve to do that. And as I've I think made clear, if we do not act and we do not act appropriately, and that this is not sustained, we will not, I don't think, have more of the same, but the situation will unfortunately become worse.
A question for Ruth and for you, Kwasi. I mean, many of the organizations involved in this process are nonprofits. What would you like to see happen on the funding side to ensure these nonprofits have the funding to engage and consult as work on this strategy moves forward in terms of its implementation?
I'm going to just jump in here first, Ruth, because it was a part of my last piece that I would have added. The lack of current commitment and certainty around funding for the strategy and the work itself, to me, is highly problematic. This work will not be undertaken in a funding or 2 funding cycles. It needs sustained investment. And that's why the establishment, for example, of specific government bodies and institutions are so important. And so, what we run the risk of happening here is that the strategy itself suffers from one of the same problems that many community organizations suffer from. And that is, really fighting for funding during funding cycles. The organizations that we've worked with as part of the justice strategy, and that many that exist in this country, are doing tremendous work. But their ability to do that work is constrained by their constant need to apply for funding, to be able to do the work that they do, to hire people simply to write grant applications, et cetera. So we need to identify, promising programs and organizations and ensure that they can undertake their work in a sustained manner, just as the strategy itself needs to be sustained.
Ruth, do you have any thoughts on it?
I would agree with Kwasi wholeheartedly. It's for nonprofit organizations, the tendency over the last decade actually has been to focus on project funded, so temporal time limited funding, and it doesn't allow for core funding hasn't been part of the funding landscape for nonprofits. And when I hear that the strategy is funded for 2 years, that concerns me, because in 2 years, if there is a change in government, if there is this has to be a priority, and it has to not be, force those who are working on the strategy, as Kwasi said, to focus on searching for funding rather than implementing the strategy itself. It really precludes the purpose of the strategy if it's not funded properly and sustainably.
Martine, do you have any response to those concerns?
Well, sustained funding is definitely important. And we're talking about transformative change. And to have transformative change and to implement all these recommendations and advance this implementation plan, it needs sustained funding. I mentioned earlier, and it's been mentioned with the other panelists, that sustained funding is needed. And if it's not addressed, if the implementation plan is not made, and these issues aren't addressed, it will continue to be a cost to all of us in Canada. So advancing the strategy only helps. I'm grateful for the emphasis on the social determinants. It's a huge, huge factor. There's been evidence of social determinants addressing things like programmatic solutions, which are diversion efforts, help and contribute versus creating a cost in the criminal justice system. So investments are definitely needed. Yes, it's 2 years funding. That decision in terms of the initial investments for the strategy was provided in the fall economic statement in 2024, and the 2-year timeframe decision was established because of the need to balance priorities in a time of fiscal restraint. And so that's the reality with the initial investment that we received for the strategy. In phase 2 of the strategy, which will begin ideally in March 2027, the Government of Canada has committed to respond to the recommendations identified in the report from the steering group members for the short-term elements. And work is currently progressing on the renewal of the strategy. So again, no decisions have been made, but we're working on it.
Marty, aside from funding, what other partnerships or support will you and your department require to support implementation?
Yes. So, as I mentioned earlier, with this work, all the recommendations, the implementation plan, it's a whole of government effort. Ruth mentioned that earlier as well, that it's a whole government system partnership effort that's required. So it's a shared responsibility in terms of the criminal law. So that's between the federal government and the provinces and the territories. The federal government is responsible for enacting criminal legislation and determining procedures in criminal matters. Provincial governments are responsible for administering justice and play the leading role in arranging the systems in and by which crimes are investigated and tried. So, this shared responsibility means that all levels of government can learn from one another and benefit from the valuable insights of members of Black communities about the issues in the criminal justice system that need to change. The report emphasized that the strategy touches on areas of federal jurisdiction, as well as areas of provincial, territorial, and municipal responsibility. And we discussed already the social determinants aspects in terms of health. And then there's also policing and supports that are available to individuals leaving custody. These are all aspects of the justice system that fall exclusively under the provincial or territorial responsibility. So we require this huge partnership to advance this transformative change. For the provincial and territorial responsibility, what's important are examples of appointment and training of provincial judges, probation policies, legal aid funding, and provincial jails. So to achieve the transformative change that's needed, all levels of government will have to collaborate.
Ruth, one of the prevailing concerns among the group when we spoke earlier was about potential silos in government. And as this strategy moves into implementation, how should we be thinking about its alignment with sort of the broader federal justice reforms that the government's looking at? And like, what's the risk if these challenges, these initiatives are not sort of fully coherent with one another?
Well, I think the Black Justice Strategy really is grounded in reducing harm, right? Systemic harm and addressing root causes, lowering overrepresentation through prevention, alternatives to custody, and survivor-centered approaches. I think the concern I raised with you was that the current federal criminal reforms, bail and sentencing, right, and victim reforms largely operate through kind of like they're being expanded, system expansion tools, such as stricter bail, broader offenses, and enforcement measures. So it creates a structural tension, right? So the strategy is aiming to reduce justice system contact, while enforcement-focused reforms risk increasing it. My concern was that these bills C16 and C14, I think, were introduced in the same policy window as the Black Justice Strategy, right? So the federal agenda is simultaneously promising transformation, but advancing measures that could, while it's advancing measures that can make those goals harder to achieve without explicit alignment, right?
Yeah.
And I think the concern is that in a system that's already marked by racial disparities, expanding enforcement will disproportionately affect Black and Indigenous communities, right? And so the key issue is not really intent, but impact. And without safeguards and coherence across policy reforms, we risk working against the objective of the Black justice strategy, right?
Mhm.
And as I said, the tension isn't just substantive, it's timing as well. And I can speak to one particular thing, in Ontario, Martine was just speaking about kind of federal and provincial and territorial coordination. Several years ago, I was involved in work with respect to school resource officers and removing school resource officers out of Ontario schools because of the impact on particularly Black students and what it meant for them and the impact on the school to prison pipeline. And a measure has just been introduced by the provincial government to put school resource officers back in schools. And so that in itself is one conflict that I can point to, as well as, of course, the federal reforms.
Understood. Martina, I wonder if you had any comment on the need for internal collaboration within government to make sure one initiative isn't working at cross purposes with another, just in general.
Yes, like I said, partnerships is huge with this work. We've got a 10-year implementation plan ahead of us with the years that remain. And this was aligned with the United Nations decade. So that's why we wanted to make sure that it is a long-term standing implementation and commitment. Partnership is key. We've got responsibilities that fall in different levels of government. We can't do this alone. Even with my role, I'm within the Department of Justice Canada, and we're limited within our jurisdiction, within the legal mandate that we have. And when we're looking at all the different aspects of this work, we've got 5 different pillars with advancing the strategy. We've got the social determinants, and these fall into other departments' responsibilities. We've got policing, we've got corrections, we've got reintegration, and what happens once people are out of the system. So it's beyond my department's responsibility, and so we have to heavily rely on partnerships at the federal level. We've got to rely on partnerships on the different levels of government, so provinces and territories. And we've got to continue the dialogue, the conversations, and learning from one another. There's some provinces and territories that are advanced in this space. And then there's others that aren't advanced in this space. So we're making sure that the dialogue is happening and the opportunity to learn from one another so that this strategy can advance at a national scale. So partnership and collaboration is key, in addition to sustained funding.
Kwasi, I wonder if I could speak to a matter, I guess, that's come up in some of our discussions. I know you have some thoughts about implementing these recommendations costs money, but there are costs to not implementing them. I wonder if you could talk about your thoughts on that sort of contradiction there, or that dynamic there.
Yeah, well, and I think, in terms of contradictions, the proposed reform to kind of bail and sentencing law are hugely contradictory with the recommendations made by the steering group and in the Black Justice Strategy. And so, the proposed changes to bail and to sentencing are likely to exacerbate the racial disparities that we already see within our criminal justice system, as opposed to ameliorate them. So as I mentioned, and we've talked about a lot, we have a heavy emphasis on the social determinants of justice, but at the same time, we recognize the dire need to address inequities within our justice system itself. Those include decisions made by individuals, policies devised by institutions, but of course also the laws that are developed and passed by our government. So we have a situation now where our government is seeking to pass laws that, if history tells us anything, are going to further entrench the racial disparities that we see today, and with no indication of how, even if the principle of restraint is acknowledged in at least one of those bills, the government will work to mitigate, impact that the bills might have on Black and Indigenous communities. So I think, again, there's a key tension there. When we think about the need for investments and upstream investments, the social determinants need to be addressed alongside the issues within the justice system itself. Addressing the social determinants of justice will undoubtedly take years and perhaps decades to begin to show their full effect. And so we need to be, continuing to focus on the justice system itself. But, I'll go back to this point that failure to act will cost us money in the long run, not save us money in this period in which we are tightening our fiscal belts. We see, of course, cuts across government. We see fiscal pressures elsewhere. And so we have here an opportunity to save the government of Canada money. We spend billions of dollars on criminal justice each year, right? Black people make up a relatively, although they're overrepresented, the number of Black people in federal institutions is not that large, but yet it still costs, perhaps a couple $100 million a year to incarcerate Black people within just our federal system, recognizing that our provincial systems house many more people. So even when we look at the scope of the investments that are being made, they pale in comparison to the costs of criminal justice. And again, so we need to take this longer term view and make these investments now for the benefit of our society in the long term. That's something often challenging for governments to do, that talked about funding cycles, that work on electoral cycles. But for the benefit of our country in the long term, these are investments that need to be made. And I'll say one more thing. One of the kind of key overarching principles within the justice strategy is the need for evidence-based reforms, right? We are firm in our belief that the system level interventions, as well as the broader system level reforms, need to be evidence-based. We have questions with respect to whether the proposed sentencing and bail reforms will have the desired benefit that they will likely have, but nonetheless, as we seek to move forward with implementing the strategy and working across sectors, we have to make sure that the approaches and the interventions and the reforms that are made are grounded in solid evidence, and that they're properly evaluated to assess their impact.
Now, we've received some audience questions, but before we get into them, Kwasi, I just want to ask you, because you sort of talk about the political terrain. Are you an optimist or a pessimist that this is going to be a good year for seeing some enactment of this strategy or pieces of the strategy?
If you'd asked me 5 years ago if we would have a Black justice strategy and whether we'd be having this conversation today, I might have been hopeful, but I could not have foreseen this. We have seen tremendous progress with respect to attention to these issues generally, and of course the political winds shift back and forth. But I'm forever an optimist. I think we have a very strong set of recommendations here that can be implemented by this government and by subsequent governments. So I'm optimistic about. I want to be optimistic about what this government will do and the commitment that they have, and I'm optimistic that the work that the steering group and the partners and those in government have helped support will have a beneficial impact for Canadian society. So to answer your question, yes, I am optimistic.
Ruth, are you an optimist or a pessimist?
I think I'm an optimist. I don't think I could do the work I do if I wasn't an optimist. I'm not always happy with the pace of change, but I see change and I look forward to more change. right? So I would say I'm an optimist as well.
Martine?
I think you have to be an optimist to be in this work.
Yes.
So I'm an optimist as well. When I was given this opportunity to take on this role, it was an honor and privilege. And I really believe in change and making a difference. And so, yes, I'm an optimist. And I share what you just said, Dr. Kwasi, in terms of this work being grounded in evidence. It's so important, it's so key. I've seen how that has been instrumental, even with the little or the data that we do have, I should say, how that was instrumental in so many conversations with advancing the strategy. I've always said that the two overrepresented groups in the criminal justice system by race are first Indigenous and the second Black. And that statistic alone has helped with the department's commitment to having two strategies. So the Indigenous justice strategy and the Black justice strategy. If we didn't have that kind of evidence, I don't think there would be a dedicated strategy in this regard. So it's instrumental, and we need more data. We need more statistics, and this work has to continue with evidence-based information. So thank you for highlighting that.
Yeah,
We've received some.
data is absolutely critical. I would agree with that.
Thank you, Ruth. We've received some questions from the audience, and I'd like to get into some of them. But here's a fundamental question. Where can one view the implementation plan? And then, by the way, it's open to the floor.
Yes, so on our Justice Canada website, you could even just Google Canada's Black Justice Strategy, and you'll have access to the implementation plan, to the external steering group report that outlines 114 recommendations, in addition to many community-based organization reports that was completed during our engagement efforts in the first year of developing this strategy, in addition to a great deal of information.
There's another question, kind of a tough question, but many people in the Black community think that the BJS, the Black Justice Strategy, is window dressing, that the federal provincial governments are not really committed to destroy anti-Black racism. Please comment, and I'll put that again to the group. Let's take that question. Martine, do you want to take it, and we'll move from there?
This is a very good question. It's a very good question. Even myself, before I took this on, I had to do some deep reflection of the advancement of this work. Is this going to be a initiative that is just going to be an effort to get a report that is going to be on a bookshelf and collect dust? When I signed up for this, I really had conversations with many stakeholders to really understand how committed is this initiative, because I don't want to be advancing something or be part of something that is not going to actually lead to transformative change. Like I said, in the 20 plus years I've been in the public service, I've never seen this level of effort for a strategy that's Black focused like this, on a national scale. So it's not nothing. It's very important, the commitment that's been made thus far. And I'm happy to see that the current leadership, the current government that we have, is committed to this furtherness of the implementation plan. So that's what I'll say in that regard. That's what comes to mind. We keep indicating the steering group's recommendations that this work needs to be transformative. We've, heard from so many Black voices across the country about wanting that sustainable change. And so we're committed to advancing that work. It is step by step. It's not change that can happen overnight. It's going to take time. But I'm proud of the 10-year implementation plan that has been put in place. And I'm very hopeful about the advancement of funding to continue this initiative, this important initiative.
Ruth and Akwasi, I wonder if you have any comments on that.
I would say I am cautiously optimistic about this. I think what gives me hope, I guess, with respect to the question whether this is just window dressing or not, is that the government could have said after the first decade, when not everything that was anticipated was achieved, we didn't do it and ended it there, right? We had our decade, it didn't work, we'll figure. Instead, what's happened is Canada has sponsored another decade, and this strategy is really significant. It is really significant, as Martine said. It's not nothing, right? There's money that's been put towards it, effort, and so I hope that it's not window dressing. I understand, of course, why that would be the thought, given the numerous, I would say, hundreds of recommendations that we have on the books for decades, right? That we've had on the books for decades. But I think, I really am hoping that this is a little bit different, given all of the effort that has been put into it. And so I'll leave it there.
Akwasi, would you like to speak to that matter?
Yeah, I'll say, certainly as a researcher and as someone that engages with organizations and communities, the level of consultation and research fatigue around such issues is really great. It's become challenging in some instances to go back to Black communities and organizations and ask them about their experiences with the criminal justice system and other social institutions and sectors, because of the innumerable commissions and inquiries and reports and research studies that have been done to date and that have produced recommendations, as Ruth has just alluded to. So I recognize and empathize with that frustration and concern around window dressing. I think really the onus is on the government here to prove Black people and Black communities wrong. But I think importantly as well, Black people, Black-led organizations and serving organizations and institutions also have a responsibility to hold government to account here. I think what is really important is that we continue to engage around the strategy. Raising awareness is absolutely key. But individuals can write to their, elected members of parliament, can engage in a number of different ways to ensure the government recognizes the sustained desire for meaningful change and stands true to its commitment to promote what, as we've kind of captured in the strategy itself, transformative change here, because that is absolutely what's needed.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this panel. There are more questions, and I think those are indicative of a great deal of interest, but some tough questions from those who are watching about this strategy and the issues that it raises. But and hopefully that discussion will go on elsewhere. In the meantime, what a thank you, a sincere thank you to our panelists, to Martine, to Ruth, and Akwasi, for joining us today and for taking us through the strategy and its implications and their work and their commitment to it. On behalf of so thank you to all of you. On behalf of the Globe and Mail, I'd also like to recognize two advisors who've provided important background and input for today's event. They are Fatima Hassan, the director of the Foundation for Black Communities, and Craig Wellington, the CEO of the Black Opportunity Fund. And they're joining us today to provide a couple of brief reflections on the discussion. A welcome to Fatima and to Craig. To Fatima, you first. What are the one or two key takeaways from the discussion today?
All right. First of all, thank you, Ian, for the question. Thank you to the panelists before us for an engaging conversation. I myself learned a lot. And thank you to the CRF and Mohammed Hashim for putting this on. And it was great to work with Craig at the BOF and the Globe and Mail to make sure that we're having this conversation today. So I know we don't have a lot of time. So to answer your question was, what's the key takeaway? There's a lot of takeaways, but I'm going to try to keep it concise. So for me, one thing that stood out is the importance and critical need for community engagement, community involvement, civil society engagement, and awareness of the process to increase the visibility and understanding of the issues that affect lives of Black people. That's one. A second one is what I heard over and over again is while there are tensions that are created within government, it's also one of the big takeaways for me was government's commitment to undoing some of the systemic harms caused to Black people and to changing the conditions of Black people in Canada. And the reason we're here today is to speak about a government sponsored and funded and hopefully implemented Black justice strategy.
Well, thank you very much. Craig, what about you? What takeaway or action item are you taking away from this discussion today?
Well, it's absolutely that action. And again, thank you to everybody for, Globe, CRRF for putting this together, FFBC to the Justice Department for the commitment of 87 million for phase one, to Martine and her team for the work that they continue to do. The 1,134 is the number of people that registered for this. And I think that to me, it's a extremely strong message that is sending to government, because it takes away the excuse that we often hear that, oh, well, is there interest in this? And that's often how funding decisions are made and priorities are being made. A year and a half ago, we hosted a town hall on the Black Justice Strategy as well with CRRF. We had about 600 people who were registered for that, 200 in person and the rest online. And again, let's just keep the momentum going, I think is something that we all hear. And definitely want to call out again, this is a 10-year strategy, but there's a 2-year commitment of funding, which leads to significant uncertainty. So if the government is committed to this strategy, it needs to make a fulsome commitment. If somebody gives me funding to build a table and gives me enough funding to build one leg, it's nice and I appreciate it, but I really can't use the table until I get 4 legs. So we have to commit all the way. This is not, you can't do this is part way. And I like the language that I've heard everybody use. It's a language of investment, right? That this is not a handout. The return on this investment for Canada as a whole will be significant, and it will be more than that cost. Because if any segment of society is prevented from achieving to their utmost potential, it holds back Canada as a whole. So I'd encourage everybody watching online to make your voices heard and continue to send the message that this is important, this is a priority, and that we're asking the government to make that commitment. And let's get the rest of the legs for the table, please.
Well, thank you, Fatima and Craig, for those insights. Here's to tables with 4 legs. The Black Justice Strategy is overseen by Canada's Minister of Justice and Attorney General, Sean Fraser. We did invite the Minister to speak as part of this webcast or to take part in a pre-interview, but he was unable to participate. We do, however, have pre-recorded remarks from Patricia Lantanzio, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. And let's take a look at the video.
Good afternoon. I'm Patricia Lantanzio, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. I'm honored to join you virtually for this important event, Finding Common Ground, Canada's Black Justice Strategy Onward to Implementation. And I want to thank the Globe and Mail and the Canadian Race Relations Foundations for creating space for a discussion that is both urgent and long overdue. Minister Fraser asked me specifically to bring this message today because this work is a shared priority and because the communities gathered here deserve to hear it directly. Il est particulièrement significatif d'être réunis aujourd'hui en ce mois de l'histoire des Noirs. C'est un moment pour célébrer la résilience, le leadership et les réalisations des communautés noires, mais aussi pour parler avec franchise des injustices et pour nous engager à transformer des systèmes qui ont trop souvent failli à servir les communautés noires. Last summer, I received my parliamentary secretary mandate letter from Minister Sean Fraser. One responsibility stood out clearly: to support the Minister of Justice in leading the implementation of Canada's Black Justice Strategy. I took that responsibility personally because this work is not theoretical. The work is about real people, real harm, and real opportunities for change. Canada's Black Justice Strategy exists because Black communities in Canada have been telling us for decades that the justice system does not treat them fairly, as accused, as victims, or as families. The overrepresentation of Black people in prisons, the underprotection of Black victims, and the deep mistrust of institutions are not coincidences. They are the result of systemic discrimination. Thankfully, systems can be changed. Je tiens à exprimer ma plus profonde gratitude au groupe directeur externe de la stratégie canadienne en matière de justice pour les personnes noires. Leur leadership, leur engagement à l'échelle nationale et leurs 114 recommandations offrent une feuille de route claire et fondée sur des données probantes pour un changement transformateur. Il s'agit de l'une des initiatives les plus sérieuses et les plus complètes jamais entreprises au Canada pour lutter contre le racisme anti-noir dans le système de justice. Our government is committed to moving from words to action. That is why, following the election, we sought $87.4 million through the previous 2024 Fall Economic Statement to begin implementation. This includes $23.6 million for the Department of Justice, funding that allowed us to extend the steering group's mandate for 2 years to ensure continued community leadership and accountability. This funding is now reaching provinces, territories, and Black-led community organizations, supporting youth diversion, victim services, and justice navigation through targeted funds from the Department of Justice Canada. These are tangible investments, already making a difference on the ground. We are also advancing legislative changes. Through Bill C-9, the Combating Hate Act, we propose to create a new standalone hate crime offense to better respond to hate-motivated crime, including violence targeting Black people. What this means in practice is clarity and accountability. When a Black person is targeted because of who they are, whether through violent attacks, threats, or intimidation rooted in hate, the law would now clearly and consistently denounce this crime and the serious harm it causes. It sends a clear message. Hate-motivated crime is not incidental, and it will be taken seriously from the very start of the justice process. Bill C-9 is currently before committee, undergoing clause-by-clause review. As it moves through Parliament, we welcome continued dialogue with Black communities, advocates, and experts on how we can strengthen it further and ensure it delivers real protection for those it is meant to serve. Through Bill C-16, the Protecting Victims Act, we responded directly to the recommendations of the steering group by proposing measures to strengthen the principle of individualized justice within youth justice and by encouraging the use of diversion and restorative justice in appropriate cases. Police and prosecutors would be expressly required to consider the personal circumstances and characteristics of accused and victims when determining whether diversion is appropriate, with particular attention to the lived realities and systemic barriers facing Indigenous people and Black people. This is a meaningful shift. It is an explicit recognition in law that systemic inequality matters in how justice is administered. At the same time, by encouraging the use of restorative justice and alternative measures, we are proposing to create pathways that prioritize accountability, rehabilitation, and community healing over cycles of incarceration, giving vulnerable communities a real opportunity to succeed rather than a permanent mark that follows them for life. This work will not be finished in 1 year or in one mandate. That is why we remain firmly committed to the 10-year implementation plan with clear priorities, phased action, and measurable outcomes. As we mark Black History Month, let me be clear. This strategy is about justice, dignity, and trust. This strategy is about building a system that protects, not punishes unfairly, and one that reflects the values we aspire to as a country. Merci pour votre leadership, merci pour votre engagement, et merci pour votre partenariat dans ce travail essentiel. Je vous souhaite un événement couronné de succès et un joyeux mois de l'histoire des Noirs au nom du ministre de la Justice et procureur général du Canada, ainsi qu'au nom du gouvernement du Canada.
Well, we're near the end of today's program, but first I'd like to welcome back to the screen Juanita Peters, the Executive Director of the Africville Museum, to close the discussion.
Thank you so much, Ian. This has been a powerful afternoon. I'm hopeful. We're all still getting up. We're all still doing the work. So here's what we've learned today. You know, we do have a Black justice strategy. It has a 10-year implementation plan. It is informed by decades of advocacy work from the very population that are adversely affected by the current policies. So what we need to do next is we have to make sure that this is fully funded. For it to be successful, we need to make sure that the public is aware of the strategy. And we also have to make sure that everybody is involved, political, all levels of politics, all levels of government and communities to be involved for this to be successful. I'm extremely hopeful, and this has just been so informative for me, and I can't wait to share this information.
Well, thank you very much, Juanita. We appreciate you joining us today and providing a helpful context and insight for the discussion we've had today. Audience members, thank you kindly for tuning in. In a moment, you'll see a QR code on your screen. Please scan it and fill out the brief survey so we can continue to improve your event experience with us. And once again, thanks to the CRRF for their partnership in making today's event possible. We will be sending everyone who registered for the webcast a link to the recording in about a week from now. So thank you again and enjoy your day. Thanks.